Nashville, Tennessee, November 1962. One of the most famous singers in the world is standing in a concert crowd, not performing, just watching, when she notices someone across the room. 6 months later, she is standing at an altar. Her manager is furious. Her family didn't show up. And the story that follows is one that nobody around her saw coming. This is the dramatic story of Brenda Lee's marriage. Born into survival. To understand why Brenda Lee's marriage shook the world around her, you first have to understand the world she came from, because nothing about her life, from the very beginning, was ordinary. She was born Brenda Mae Tarpley on December 11th, 1944, in Atlanta, Georgia. She weighed only 4 pounds and 11 ounces, delivered in the charity ward of Grady Memorial Hospital. The doctors weren't certain she would survive the first days of her life. She did. Her parents, Reuben Lindsay Tarpley and Annie Grace Tarpley, were working-class people doing everything they could to stay afloat. Her father was a carpenter. Her mother worked grueling hours, sometimes 12 to 14 hours a day, at a cotton mill. The family didn't own a car. There were stretches where they couldn't afford basic medical care or enough food. At Christmas time, fruit was a luxury. This was the steady, grinding reality of poverty. What Brenda did have, from an almost impossibly young age, was a voice. Too large, too powerful, too complete to be coming from a child her size. She was singing publicly by the time she was 4. At 5 or 6, she won first prize at a local talent festival, singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," with a confidence that left people blinking. She could hold a melody after hearing it only twice, but everything that her voice promised was suddenly threatened when Brenda was just 8 years old. Her father, Reuben, died in a construction accident, falling from a scaffold while working. Her mother was now alone with 4 children and no safety net. For a time, the family bounced between relatives, staying wherever there was a spare room and a willing family member to take them in. It was around this time that Brenda's mother, Grace, recognized that her daughter's singing wasn't just a talent, it was a lifeline. She began actively seeking out opportunities for Brenda to perform. A local disc jockey named Peanuts Fairclough, who saw Brenda perform early on, was the person who suggested shortening her name from Brenda Mae Tarpley to simply Brenda Lee, saying it would be easier to remember. It was a small change, but it stuck. Grace later remarried a man named Jay Rainwater, who opened a record shop where Brenda would sometimes sing on weekends. It gave her a stage, even a modest one, and kept her performing while the family found its footing again. The real turning point came in 1955, when Brenda was 10 years old. She had the chance to audition for country music star Red Foley, and she made an impression so immediate and undeniable that Foley invited her to appear on his nationally televised show, Ozark Jubilee. When she stepped up and performed the song Dynamite, a number full of fire and attitude, the audience response was overwhelming. She was small, barely past the height of a kitchen counter, but the voice that came out of her was enormous. From that performance, she earned the nickname that would follow her for the rest of her career: Little Miss Dynamite. From there, things moved fast. She began making appearances on some of the most watched television programs in the country. Shows hosted by Steve Allen, Red Skelton, and Ed Sullivan. By 1956, record companies were competing for her signature. She signed with Decca Records and was placed under the guidance of a legendary producer named Owen Bradley, who ran a studio operation in Nashville that would go on to shape the sound of country music for a generation. Dub Albritton, the man who had been managing Red Foley, stepped into the role of Brenda's manager, and he would become one of the most significant figures in her professional life, and in many ways, One of the most significant figures in her personal life, too. All Britain was forceful, opinionated, relentlessly ambitious, and deeply strategic. He had come up through the carnival circuit. He and Colonel Tom Parker, who would later manage Elvis Presley, were old friends from those days. And he knew how to create excitement, build mystique, and push an act into markets that other managers hadn't considered. He was also protective of Brenda in ways that went beyond the professional, and he gave her some of the structure and security that the loss of her father had taken away. She has spoken about him as a kind of father figure, strict in some ways, but genuinely caring. One of All Britain's decisions that had a lasting impact was pushing Brenda's career into international markets before she had achieved total saturation in the United States. He pursued Europe and South America aggressively, and it worked. By the time Brenda was 15, she was a major star in England and France. A tour she did in France drew comparisons in the French press to Judy Garland, not a small thing for a teenage girl from Georgia. There was an odd wrinkle in the international fame. Because Brenda's voice was so powerful and mature-sounding, the foreign press had a hard time believing she was actually a child. A rumor circulated in France that she was, in fact, a fully grown adult, a midget, some outlets suggested. Her team had to produce photographs and documentation to prove otherwise. Back home, the hits were arriving regularly. "Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree," which she had recorded at 12 years old in 1958, would take 2 years to gain real traction, but when it did, it never truly left. "Sweet Nothings" went to #1 on the rock and roll charts in 1959. "I'm Sorry" topped the pop charts in 1960, followed by "I Want to Be Wanted," which did the same thing. By the time Brenda was 16, she had scored multiple #1 records in multiple countries and was one of the most recognizable voices in the world. But the money she was earning was another matter entirely. Under the Jackie Coogan law, a legal provision put in place after the famous child actor Jackie Coogan was left with nothing after his earnings were spent by his parents, the bulk of Brenda's income was held in trust until she turned 21. She was performing at a global level, carrying the weight of her family's financial survival, and yet the earnings were largely untouchable for years. Meanwhile, in 1959, her stepfather deserted the family, leaving her mother and siblings with almost nothing to live on. For a while, despite everything Brenda was accomplishing on stage, her mother and siblings were living in a trailer park on $75 a month. She was touring the world and singing to thousands every night, and the people she loved most were struggling to make ends meet at home. By 1962, Brenda Lee was one of the biggest pop stars on the planet. She had toured with artists like Patsy Cline, George Jones, and Mel Tillis. She had performed at the Grand Ole Opry, played Las Vegas, traveled throughout Europe and South America. She had spent more of her childhood in dressing rooms, tour buses, and recording studios than in school classrooms, and she was 18 years old. She had never really had the chance to just be a girl. And then, on a November night in 1962, she walked into the Fairgrounds Coliseum in Nashville to watch a concert, not perform one. And that was about to change everything. The night at the fairgrounds. It was a Bo Diddley and Jackie Wilson concert at the Nashville Fairgrounds Coliseum in November of 1962. Brenda had gone to the show that night with her friend Rita Coolidge, who would go on to have her own successful recording career. And it was a rare evening off, a chance to be in the audience rather than on the stage. At some point during the evening, Brenda looked across the crowd and noticed someone, a young man. She has described, in interviews over the years, the immediate impact of that first glance. Someone she instantly felt she had to meet. His name was Charles Ronald Shacklet, though everyone called him Ronnie. He was tall, 6'4", which created quite a contrast with Brenda's 4'9". And he was from Nashville. His father, Earl C. Shacklet, was a prominent figure in the city's local government and would later become one of the founding members of the Metropolitan Council. Brenda didn't simply walk over and introduce herself. Instead, she did something that says a lot about who she was at 18. She wrote him a note. She explained in the note that she was about to leave for a 3-month tour of England and would be abroad for quite a while. She included her phone number and told him to call her when she got back. She handed him the note and left for England. For those 3 months, she didn't hear from him. Not a call, not a letter. She travelled through England, performed, and came home. But when she returned to Nashville, the two connected, set up a date, and began spending time together. What followed was described by those around her as a quiet courtship, one that Brenda kept largely to herself. She didn't announce the relationship publicly. She didn't tell her family right away. There was a period of several months where she knew what was happening between her and Ronnie, and the people around her simply didn't. She had always had so many eyes on her, so many people weighing in on her choices, that having something entirely her own must have felt like a rare and precious thing. By early 1963, it was clear to both of them where things were headed. They were going to get married, and that was the moment when the private became unavoidably public, because there were people in Brenda Lee's life who had very strong opinions about what she should and shouldn't do, and marriage to a young man she had known for less than 6 months was very much on the list of things they did not want her to do. The tension was building on more than one front, and what happened next would catch nearly everyone off guard. A wedding nobody saw coming. The disapproval came from 2 directions at once, and both of them hit hard. Dub Albritton, Brenda's manager, the man who had guided her career, helped build her into an international star, and served as one of the closest things to a father figure she had known since losing her own father, was strongly against the marriage. His reasoning was rooted in the music industry logic of the era. Female stars, especially young ones at the height of their commercial appeal, were expected to remain unattached. The thinking went that a married pop star lost a certain quality of fantasy for her audience, that fans, especially young male fans, wanted to believe in a possibility that marriage eliminated. It sounds calculated and cold by today's standards, but in the early 1960s, it was a genuinely dominant belief among music industry managers and label executives. Albritton had larger plans for Brenda. He had already arranged for her to appear at the Copacabana in New York on May 2nd, 1963, one of the most prestigious and high-profile venues in the country. The plan, as far as the management side was concerned, was that if the wedding was going to happen at all, it should happen after that appearance, once the professional moment had passed. There was talk of waiting, of timing, of what was best for the career. Brenda's family was also not on board. Her mother and siblings had depended on Brenda's earnings and presence for years. The idea of her making a major life decision this quickly, this young, with someone they didn't know well, it was too much, too fast. Whether the objection was emotional or practical, or some combination of both, the result was the same. No one from Brenda's family planned to attend any wedding. But Brenda and Ronnie didn't wait. On April 24th, 1963, without announcement or fanfare, Brenda Lee and Ronnie Shacklet were married at the Radnor Church of Christ in Nashville. They did not wait until after the Copacabana appearance. They did not arrange a grand ceremony. Brenda wore a white 2-piece suit. The witnesses were members of Ronnie's family. Not a single person from Brenda's own family was present in that church. Think about what that image looks like for a moment. One of the most famous singers in the world, at 18 years old, standing in a church in Nashville, getting married, and the pews on her side of the aisle are empty. No mother, no siblings, just Ronnie, his family, and the quiet of a Sunday morning in a neighborhood church. The next day, the story broke in the Nashville press. A journalist named Gerald Henry wrote the story for the Tennessean, and it ran on April 25th, 1963, describing the quiet, unannounced ceremony. The headline alone was enough to spread the news through Nashville's music community like a brushfire. The world's most famous teenage pop star had eloped. Nobody had known it was coming. Almost nobody had been invited. When it was over, the newlyweds didn't linger in the city. They left for Gatlinburg, Tennessee, for their honeymoon, a small mountain resort town tucked into the Smoky Mountains, quiet and removed from the noise of Nashville and the press. They simply went. Together. There is something quietly defiant about the whole picture. For a decade, Brenda Lee had been managed, guided, scheduled, monitored, and shaped by the people around her. Her voice had been the family's salvation, her manager's project, the music industry's product. For once, she had done something entirely on her own terms, and no amount of professional calculation or family pressure had stopped her. The career concerns, the timing, the Copacabana appearance, she had looked at all of it and chosen Ronnie Shacklet. What no one fully anticipated at the time was what that choice was actually going to mean for her, both in the years immediately ahead and for the rest of her life. The world they were stepping into. The first years of a marriage are rarely uncomplicated, and for Brenda and Ronnie, the complications were built into the very fabric of their daily reality in ways that most young couples don't encounter. Brenda was still one of the biggest stars in pop music. She continued recording and performing after the wedding. The music didn't stop. The touring didn't stop. The demands of the industry didn't slow down simply because she had gotten married. In 1963, the same year she got married, the single Losing You was released and charted well. In 1964, Is It True followed. The career was still very much alive and in motion, but the world of popular music was shifting in a way that nobody in the American music industry had fully prepared for. In February 1964, less than a year after Brenda and Ronnie's wedding, the Beatles arrived in the United States. Their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show drew an audience of 73 million people. Almost overnight, the musical landscape transformed. The British invasion reshaped what radio programmers wanted, what record labels were signing, and what young audiences were responding to. Artists who had dominated the charts just a year or two before found themselves being pushed aside by the new wave of British bands. Brenda was among those affected. The hits became less frequent. The commercial momentum that had felt so natural and steady throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s began to slow. For a young woman who had known no other life but performing and recording, who had been told from childhood that she needed to keep working or there might not be another gig, this was deeply unsettling. And then, in the mid-1960s, came a loss that hit her differently. Dub Allbritton had been dealing with significant health problems for several years before his death in 1970. Near the end, he called Brenda to his apartment, knowing his time was short, and that visit stayed with her for decades. She has acknowledged that this period brought on a real depression, a sense of not knowing where she fit anymore in an industry that had changed drastically around her. It's worth pausing here to recognize what Ronnie Shacklet's presence meant during this period. He was the constant. While the music industry shifted, and the people who had defined the structure of her professional life came and went, Ronnie was there. He didn't come from the music world. He understood it well enough to navigate it on her behalf, but he wasn't of it. And that distinction mattered. In the early years of their marriage, Ronnie became actively involved in protecting Brenda's financial interests. The music industry in the 1960s was full of situations where artists, especially artists who had been working since childhood, with complicated contractual histories and multiple layers of management, were vulnerable to exploitation. People who had seen her earning capacity since she was a child sometimes treated her financial arrangements as opportunities. Ronnie was someone who looked at those situations clearly and pushed back on them. His involvement helped ensure that the wealth Brenda had spent her entire childhood generating actually remained in her control. It's also worth noting who Ronnie Shacklet was, outside of his connection to Brenda's career. He was a private man by nature, something that stood in sharp contrast to the world his wife inhabited. He built his own business renovating fire-damaged homes, ran it for years, then eventually handed things over to his brothers. He never sought the spotlight, never chased celebrity, and kept a low profile throughout decades in which his wife was one of the most recognized voices in the world. He simply chose, quietly and consistently, to show up for his family. In the years following the wedding, Brenda and Ronnie started their family. They had 2 daughters. Their first daughter, Jolie, arrived, and then came Julie. Julie's birth was one of the most frightening moments the family would face together. She was born with a condition called hyaline membrane disease, a serious lung condition affecting newborns that makes breathing extremely difficult, and which was, at the time, frequently fatal in infants. The prognosis was deeply uncertain. The doctors who worked to save Julie's life included a physician named Dr. Mildred Stallman, a pioneer in neonatal care who had also attended to the births of the Kennedy children. Julie survived, but the ordeal was an intense and terrifying one. As a couple, they had walked into that experience together and come out the other side. Julie's name carried its own quiet significance. Brenda named her after the daughter of Patsy Cline, a tribute to her fellow country artist who had died in a plane crash in 1963, the same year Brenda and Ronnie got married. It was a small, personal gesture, but it speaks to the kind of woman Brenda was. Someone who remembered, who honored people, who carried the people she loved with her in the details of her life. The challenges of the late 1960s and early 1970s were real and ongoing, but they were being faced by 2 people who had chosen each other, held on to that choice, and were building something together that didn't depend on chart positions or industry trends to stay standing. And then the health scare arrived. When the body sends a warning. By the early 1970s, the toll of a lifetime on the road had become impossible to ignore. Years of touring, constant travel, irregular schedules, the physical demands of live performance night after night, it had added up. In 1974, the warning arrived in the most serious form possible. She was rushed to the hospital with life-threatening blood clots. The condition required emergency surgery, and the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The surgery was performed, and it saved her life. The experience had a clarifying effect. The years of feeling pushed and pulled by industry pressures, the years of performing out of obligation and anxiety as much as out of love, the accumulated fatigue of a childhood that had never really had the luxury of just being a childhood, all of it pressed in around that medical crisis in a way that couldn't be ignored. What came next, though, was something close to a resurrection. Later that same year, Brenda returned to recording. She went back to her country music roots, the sound that had been in her blood before the pop charts and the international tours. She recorded Nobody Wins, written by Chris Christopherson, and the song climbed into the top 10 on the country charts. It was a genuine comeback, driven by conviction rather than commercial calculation. The string of country hits that followed in the mid and late 1970s confirmed that she hadn't simply survived. She had found her way back to something essential. Songs like Big Four Poster Bed, Wrong Ideas, and Sunday Sunrise all performed well on the country charts. A new generation of country music fans discovered her voice. She was no longer just a relic of the early 1960s pop era. She was an active, relevant presence in a different musical world. Throughout this entire period, the health scare, the surgery, the recovery, the return, Ronnie was there. He had been there through the lean years following the British invasion. He had been there when Julie was born, fighting for her life. He had been there when the career felt adrift after the loss of all Britain. He had been there through every professional shift and personal loss the previous decade had brought. And he was there now, in the hospital and in the long recovery that followed, consistent in the way he had always been consistent. The career that followed the mid-1970s comeback continued steadily. In 1989, Brenda appeared on a K.D. Lang album called Shadowland, which earned a Grammy nomination. She continued performing into the 1990s and beyond, accumulating honors and recognitions along the way. Induction ceremonies, Hall of Fame acknowledgements, and a legacy that became clearer and more celebrated with each passing decade. But time kept moving, and the people she had built her life around were not immune to it. Losing the pillars. The story of Brenda Lee's marriage is partly a story about what endures and partly a story about loss. In 1998, Owen Bradley died. Bradley had been the other great constant in Brenda's professional life. He was the producer who had guided her recordings at Decca, the man who sat behind the glass in the studio and helped translate what she was capable of into something the world could hear. He had been her creative collaborator and her mentor, and over the decades their relationship had grown into something that went far beyond the professional. He was, alongside Dub All Britain, one of the father figures she had leaned on since childhood. She spoke about his death with a grief that was unmistakably deep. She mustered herself to sing "There Will Be Peace in the Valley" at his funeral, standing up and performing for someone she was devastated to have lost. It was one of the most personally difficult performances of her life. The following year, 1999, brought another kind of threat. This one directed at the voice that had carried her through everything. She was diagnosed with cysts on her vocal cords. The treatment options presented a difficult choice. Surgery could remove the cysts, but there was a meaningful risk that it could also cause permanent damage to her voice. For someone whose voice had been her entire life, her family's survival, her career, her identity, the prospect of that risk was not a small thing to weigh. She chose to take time off instead of proceeding with surgery. She rested, let her body settle, and waited to see what would happen. The cysts did not disappear entirely, but the vocal cord damage stabilized. She didn't lose her voice. And eventually, carefully, she returned to performing. What is striking about this entire stretch of her story, the late 1990s, the losses, the medical decisions, the grief, is how consistently Ronnie Shacklet appears as the person she came home to. Not as a manager or an industry figure or a professional handler, but simply as her husband, the man she had chosen in 1963 against the advice of everyone around her. It is worth thinking about what the alternative might have looked like if she had listened to her management and waited until after the Copacabana appearance, if she had let the industry calculation win out over what she felt, if she had deferred to the people who thought they knew better about what a pop star's life should look like. The answer, of course, is that she didn't. What 60 years looks like. By the time the 2020s arrived, Brenda Lee had been married to Ronnie Shacklet for more than 60 years. The milestone is significant not just as a number, but as a rarity, a genuine outlier. In an industry where marriages routinely fracture under the pressure of touring schedules, public scrutiny, financial volatility, and the general chaos of a life spent in the spotlight, their marriage had held together through all of it. Through the British invasion, through the blood clots, through the losses, through the career highs and the quiet stretches in between. They had raised 2 daughters. They had watched those daughters grow into adults and become mothers themselves. They had 3 grandchildren, Taylor, Jordan, and Charlie. They had built a life in Nashville, the same city where they had met at a concert on a November night in 1962, and where they had stood together in a church, just the 2 of them on her side of the aisle, and decided to begin. Brenda's retirement came with the same directness she had applied to most decisions in her life. She stepped back, not because she had stopped loving music, but because she looked at what the industry had become and recognized there wasn't a natural place for what she was doing anymore. She had won every award available to her. She had charted hits in multiple decades. When she finally stepped back, she did it with clear-eyed satisfaction rather than trailing reluctance. The one surprise that kept arriving, that kept finding her after she had largely retired, was "Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree." The song she had recorded in 1958 at 12 years old, written by Johnny Marks, had never stopped being played. But in 2023, something happened that placed it in a category no one had anticipated. The song was streamed in numbers that made it eligible for modern chart certification, and it reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, more than 60 years after it had been recorded. Brenda Lee, who had been 12 years old when she sang it in a Nashville studio, became one of the oldest artists to ever top the chart in the song's modern streaming era. The achievement was covered widely in the press, and it brought a fresh wave of attention and affection from audiences, many of whom hadn't followed her career but knew the song. She spoke about it with the warmth and lightness of someone who had been around long enough to find unexpected things genuinely funny and genuinely moving at the same time. Ronnie, as always, was not the one standing in front of the camera. He has never been the one in the spotlight. Throughout 6 decades of press coverage of his wife's career, he has remained almost entirely out of frame. By choice, by temperament, by a consistent preference for privacy that has never wavered. What is known about him is drawn largely from a single newspaper article from 1963, a few biographical details, and what can be gathered from the shape of the life he and Brenda built together. He ran his business. He raised his family. He protected his wife from exploitation at moments when she needed protecting. And he stayed, through 60 years of a world that gave him every opportunity to be pulled away from the quiet life he had chosen. There's something in that consistency that the music industry, with all of its noise, doesn't always make room for. The people who are most loudly present in a public figure's life are often the ones who take the most. The ones who are there for what the career produces, for what the name opens, for what the talent generates. Ronnie Shacklet was none of those things. He was simply the man who had noticed her at a concert in 1962 and kept showing up every day after that. They still live in Nashville, Tennessee, in the city where it all began, in the city that had watched a teenage girl carry her family out of poverty with nothing but her voice. In the same city where a wedding happened one quiet April morning with the bride's side of the church empty and the whole world none the wiser until the next day's paper. Brenda has talked about the life she chose, talked about stepping away from performing, about what the industry meant to her, about what music meant to her. And the portrait that emerges is of someone who is genuinely at peace, Someone who looks back at a life full of early mornings and late nights and hard decisions and says, plainly, that she got it right. She also has a dog. Her husband found it in 2012, 4 weeks old, abandoned in the middle of an interstate highway, malnourished and barely alive, and brought it home. Brenda had only recently lost a beloved pet and was not looking for another one. But she saw the puppy and took it in, nursed it back to health, and kept it. They call her Little Girl. She weighs 86 pounds and has apparently never been given back to anyone. It is, in its own quiet way, a very Brenda Lee story. Someone puts something small and overlooked in front of her, and she decides it deserves a chance. The marriage in full. Looking at the whole of this story, from Atlanta in 1944 to Nashville in the 2020s, the marriage sits at the center of it in a way that is easy to overlook if you're only watching the career. The career is the more visible thing: the chart positions, the television appearances, the tours, the records, the Hall of Fame inductions, the Christmas song that won't die. Those are the things that fill the Wikipedia pages. And they matter. Brenda Lee's contribution to American popular music is real and substantial. Her voice, at its peak, was one of the most recognizable sounds on the radio anywhere in the world. But the life behind all of that was built around the choice she made on April 24th, 1963, at the Radnor Church of Christ in Nashville. In a white two-piece suit, with Ronnie Shacklet's family watching and no one from her own family present. She made that choice at 18 years old, 6 months into knowing the man, against the counsel of her manager, against the wishes of her mother, in defiance of industry convention, and weeks ahead of the schedule that the people managing her career had laid out. There was nothing calculated about it, nothing strategic. It was just the decision of a young woman who had spent her entire childhood being managed and shaped and guided and scheduled, choosing, for once, to do what she wanted. The people who tried to steer her away from it weren't wrong to be concerned. The risks were real. A marriage at 18, to someone she'd known less than 6 months, at the peak of her commercial appeal, in an industry with every historical reason to expect it to fall apart. The skepticism was entirely understandable. But it didn't fall apart. What Ronnie Shacklet turned out to be, not in the immediate blush of 1963, but across the arc of decades, was exactly what the people warning Brenda against him had not calculated for. He became the financial protector who pushed back against exploitation at moments when she needed someone to do that. He became the steady, private presence that absorbed the turbulence of a public life without adding to it. He became the father of her children, the person beside her through surgeries and losses and industry upheavals, the one who found a 4-week-old dog on a highway and brought it home because he knew she would want it. He became, simply, her husband, in the fullest meaning of the word. There is a version of Brenda Lee's story that goes differently, where the management pressure wins out and she waits. And maybe the right timing never quite arrives. Where the industry convention about married pop stars proves correct and the fan base drifts. Where the financial exploitation that Ronnie eventually pushed back on does its damage first. That version of the story doesn't have the same ending. It doesn't have 60 years and 3 grandchildren and a quiet house in Nashville and a big dog named Little Girl. The dramatic part of this story, the part that made headlines in 1963, the elopement and the empty pews and the family who didn't come and the manager who objected, turns out not to be the story of something that went wrong. It turns out to be the story of something that went exactly right, in exactly the way that no one around her could see at the time. Brenda Lee had spent her whole life being told what to do and when to do it. She had sung for presidents and played Vegas and toured Europe as a teenager and carried her family's survival on her voice since she was barely old enough to go to school. She had never really had anything that was entirely her own. When she finally looked up from all of it and made a decision purely for herself, she made a good one. And the decades that followed proved it, quietly and completely, 1 year at a time. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.